We are the ones in the best position to make it move forward. So that's something you got to consider when working with an architect. But those are the 3 things you need to consider when working with a project down here in lovely South Florida. Here is why designing in South Florida architecture is a different beast than anywhere else in the country. Let's jump into it. Designing in South Florida, there's 3 main things we got to talk about because South Florida being in a unique area, number 1, we got hurricanes, number 2, we got heat, and number 3 is the cities. We're going to talk about each one of them, but first, let's jump into the hurricanes. So in the United States, obviously, we're down southeast. We get a lot of hurricanes. For us, different than California, different than New York, we have to deal with wind speeds up to 100, up to 170 mile per hour winds.
And yesterday...
And as a fact, we have to then incorporate that into our designs. What does this mean? So from our side, this means having stronger foundations, impact-rated windows, roof systems that are tied down. Pretty much anything that you put on a building has to be tied down in the event that it flies away in the wind. This can be AC condensers, screening, railings, roofing materials, you name it, but anything that's mounted to a building basically can't fly away. So opposed to like California or New York, which gets cold, that get earthquakes, we have to account for these crazy winds. Number 2 is the heat. The heat and humidity of South Florida is different than anywhere else in the country. Typical humidity down here is about 80% humidity. What this means is that the water transfer outside to inside when we're cooling the space can cause some problems. So you have heat and humidity, 2 problemos. Unlike California, Wisconsin, New York, cold, hot, a little different. So down here, we have to cool the interior space of a building, at the same time keep the water out of it. Everywhere else in the country, it's the complete opposite. We're the weird balls down here, but it is what it is, South Florida. So what do? So we have a different way of insulating our buildings versus New York. We put the insulation vapor barrier on the inside versus the outside to keep the water transfer from coming in. Aside from that, we also air conditioning all of our spaces with central AC, mini splits, and so on. The goal is to keep the inside cool and keep the heat out. But again, the humidity does pose a problem. So you take that in effect with the hurricanes, it gets a little more complicated down here. So designing in South Florida is its own beast because of these 2 reasons. Now, let's hit number 3, the cities. Number 3, last but not least, is the city. The authority having jurisdiction down here in South Florida is different than no other. So down in South Florida, we have Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Fort Myers, West Palm Beach, the main cities, and in between those are little sub-cities. Now, we're working with down here, they have certain restrictions, certain zoning requirements that, well, down here is a little different than other cities. They have their own process, their own rules, regulations, people you know, connections, etc. So when taking into account the hurricanes, taking into account the heat, not only to design a nice building, but you have to get it approved, and that's working with the cities down here. The cities down here are their beasts of their own. Every city has its own little requirement, and there's multiple. I can name 5 off the top of my head, but at the end of the day, every city has its own set of rules, and understanding those rules to get your project approved on top of designing everything gets kind of crazy. So what's the solution? The solution is to work with someone down on the ground, boots on the ground, understands these ins and outs. If you don't understand these ins and outs, it can delay your project, which leads to cost overruns, which leads to bad clients being mad at you, and you look bad and nothing really works out. So at the end of the day, we have to account for the hurricanes, we got to account for the heat, and also knowing the ins and outs of a city all at once, it's important to hire the right architect. Whether it's me, Johnny, or Joe, you want to hire someone that understands the lay of the land. If I bring an architect in from, I don't know, Wisconsin down to South Florida, it's going to be problematic. But us being in South Florida, we know how it works. We are the ones in the best position to make it move forward. So that's something you got to consider when working with an architect. But those are the 3 things you need to consider when working with a project down here in lovely South Florida.